HOA president fines me $500 for my backyard. But I'm a Supreme Court judge. Judge Daniel Blake stood in his backyard. The calmness of the suburban neighborhood, a sharp contrast to the fast-paced world he'd left behind in the courtroom. At 58, he had earned his peace. An oasis of green surrounded by towering trees, fragrant flowers, and rows of neatly planted vegetables that he took immense pride in. His hands, accustomed to handling legal documents, had also learned the delicate art of tending to his garden. It was his place of refuge, where the weight of judgments and high-profile cases fell away, replaced by the simple rhythm of planting and pruning. Blake had lived in this neighborhood for over 2 decades, and despite the rigid rules of the HOA, he had always felt at home. The streets were always pristine, the lawns meticulously manicured, and the homes, though different in design, all followed the same quiet uniformity. He respected the HOA's presence, even if their rules were sometimes a bit too restrictive. But today something felt off. The envelope in his hand, heavy with anticipation, was a stark reminder of the world he couldn't escape, one that had followed him right into his sanctuary. The letter was from Clara Westbrook, the HOA president, a woman known for her sharp adherence to the rules and a reputation for holding residents to the letter of the law. Blake opened it slowly, dreading what it might say. A fine. $500. For what? His vegetable garden. Clara's words were clear. It violated the HOA's landscaping code. As a judge, Daniel Blake ruled on cases that could change lives, he thought bitterly. But today, he was about to find himself on the receiving end of a decision that might change his own. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden hue over Judge Blake's backyard as he knelt beside his vegetable garden. His hands, weathered from years of legal work, moved carefully through the rows of tomatoes and squash, pruning here, pulling weeds there. It was a peaceful ritual, one that had kept him grounded through many stressful cases. The quiet hum of bees flitting from flower to flower, the scent of fresh earth. It was his sanctuary. He was lost in the moment, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and his own slow, steady breathing. That is, until a faint rustle from behind him snapped him out of his trance. Glancing up, he saw the familiar shape of a letter stuck between the slats of the wooden fence. An official letter with the HOA's distinctive seal. His stomach tightened. Blake wiped his hands on his jeans and stood, brushing the dirt off his palms as he walked toward the letter. He wasn't sure what to expect, but a growing sense of unease gripped him. As he tore open the envelope, the words jumped off the page. $500 fine for noncompliance with HOA landscaping guidelines. The fine was for the overgrowth of his vegetable garden. His garden, his pride and joy. He couldn't believe it. The calm, deliberate judge, who had ruled over countless cases with authority, was now staring at a decision he never thought he'd have to face. A battle in his own backyard, with no easy verdict. Judge Blake sat down heavily in his living room, the letter still in his hands as though it were some kind of cruel joke. The formal tone of the letter grated against him as he read through the sections highlighting the HOA's strict rules on uniform lawn maintenance and neat garden design. The language was technical, almost robotic, as if his home had been reduced to a series of arbitrary standards rather than a place of personal expression. His eyes flicked back to the description of the violation. Overgrowth of vegetable garden, violating the aesthetic integrity of the community. A strange sensation crept into his chest, disbelief mixed with frustration. His garden was nothing extravagant, just rows of tomatoes, carrots, and the occasional flower. Yet somehow it had become an issue. As his fingers traced the words again, a nagging thought entered his mind. Was this personal? He thought back to the recent HOA board meeting where he had, once again, found himself at odds with Harold Woods, the HOA president. Harold had openly criticized Blake's non-traditional gardening choices in front of the whole board, making thinly veiled comments about how the wild look of his garden didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. Blake had brushed it off as a petty remark at the time, but now, sitting in his living room, the thought seemed more ominous. Was this retaliation? The suspicion gnawed at him. As a judge, he was used to maintaining objectivity, but now he was being dragged into a personal dispute that could shatter his quiet life. Judge Blake sat at his mahogany desk in his study, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He pulled the thick HOA handbook from the top shelf of his bookcase, the same shelf where he kept his most trusted legal texts. His fingers paused for a moment over the binding, as if steeling himself for what was about to come. He'd spent his entire career meticulously examining the law, looking for patterns, nuances, and loopholes. This time, though, it wasn't a criminal case or a civil dispute he was tackling. It was something far more personal. The pages of the handbook were stiff, almost unused, as though no one in the neighborhood had actually bothered to read the fine print. Blake's eyes scanned the regulations on lawn uniformity and garden aesthetics. At first glance, the rules seemed simple enough. Lawn height, flower colors, the placement of trees, but something didn't sit right. He ran his finger down the list of guidelines, cross-referencing them with the fine he'd received. The language was vague, filled with terms like aesthetic integrity and community standard, leaving too much room for interpretation. Blake's mind began to race. He opened a drawer and pulled out legal papers from past HOA disputes he'd kept for research purposes. He knew that HOAs often enforced rules inconsistently, but he needed proof. He began combing through online forums, reading stories from other residents who'd dealt with similar fines. Some complaints were downright absurd. One woman had been fined for a misplaced lawn gnome, but the real gems were the accounts of selective enforcement, where certain residents, especially those with influence, seemed exempt from fines. As he compiled the evidence, his gut tightened. This was no coincidence. He was no stranger to the power dynamics in legal battles, but this was different. This wasn't just about a garden. It was about the abuse of authority, and he was determined to expose it. Blake scribbled notes outlining his next steps. He would fight this. The suspense built as Blake's mind sharpened with each discovery, the reader hooked by his determination to find the truth behind the HOA's shady practices. How far would he go to uncover the loopholes? And what would he do once he found them? Judge Blake stood outside the HOA office, his jaw set in quiet resolve. The building was small, nothing more than a modest, brick structure tucked between two oversized homes. Inside, the air was sterile, with rows of filing cabinets and walls adorned with meticulously framed community rules. Harold Woods, the HOA president, sat behind a desk that was far too large for such a tiny office, his imposing presence filling the room. Woods was a man of self-importance, in his late 60s, with a penchant for power that showed in the way he carried himself. He was dressed in a tailored suit, though it felt more like a costume, one he wore to remind others of his stature. As Blake entered, Harold barely looked up, but the smile that crept onto his face made it clear he knew why the judge was here. "You received my letter, I take it?" Harold asked, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. Blake nodded, holding up the letter. "Yes, I came to discuss the fine." Harold leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a self-satisfied manner. "As I said in the letter, Judge Blake, your garden does not comply with our guidelines. The simple, you know the rules." Blake's eyes narrowed. He had hoped for a more reasonable discussion, but Harold's tone made it clear that this was about more than just a garden. "I believe the rules are being applied selectively," Blake replied, his voice calm but firm. Harold smirked, his eyes gleaming with a hidden malice. "Selective enforcement? Perhaps. But it's not just your garden, Judge. There are other things around here that could come under scrutiny. Neighbors' properties, for instance. Small things. Maybe I'll take a closer look. Who knows what I might find?" The threat hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Blake felt a chill run down his spine. He had been right, this wasn't about a garden. This was personal. Harold wasn't just enforcing rules, he was targeting him. Judge Daniel Blake stood at the front of the courtroom, his voice steady as he addressed the bench. The familiar hum of the courtroom, the soft shuffle of papers, and the low murmur of observers seemed distant, almost drowned out by the pounding in his chest. This was his domain, where he had spent years delivering impartial judgments, where the law was supposed to be the final word. Yet, today, it felt different. The weight of his own case pressed down on him. Blake had filed a motion to contest the fine, confident that his legal expertise would dismantle the HOA's overreach. He had meticulously prepared, compiling evidence of the HOA's selective enforcement and inconsistent application of their rules. This, he believed, would be enough to convince the court that the fine against his backyard was not just unjust but an abuse of power. However, as Judge Martin, an old colleague, began to speak, Blake's confidence wavered. Judge Martin, a man known for his conservative views and quiet deference to local power structures, glanced down at the papers and then up at Blake with an unsettling air of indifference. "I've reviewed your case, Judge Blake, and after careful consideration, I'm afraid I'm going to have to dismiss it." Blake's heart sank. He had expected resistance, but not this. "I find no merit in your claims," Judge Martin continued, his voice calm but final. "The HOA's rules are clear, and their enforcement is within legal bounds. I see no reason to intervene." Blake felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. This wasn't just about a garden. The HOA's influence had reached deep into the community and, it seemed, even into the judiciary. His colleagues were unwilling to challenge the HOA's power, unwilling to risk the ramifications of going against it. He was alone in this fight. That night, after a long day of futile legal battles, Judge Daniel Blake sat in his living room, the dim light from the fireplace casting shadows on the walls. He stared at the glass of scotch in his hand, the amber liquid swirling, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He hadn't said much since he came home. Too angry, too exhausted to speak. The letter, the fine, the court dismissal, all of it weighed heavily on him. Sarah, his wife of 30 years, sat across from him, her eyes full of concern as she watched him, waiting for him to speak. Finally, the silence broke. "I don't know what to do anymore, Sarah," Blake muttered, his voice raw. "I followed the law. I know the law. But every step I take, it feels like I'm fighting a system that doesn't want me to win." Sarah leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You're not just fighting the HOA, Daniel. This isn't just about the garden or the fine." He looked up at her, searching her face for understanding. "They're using this against you," she continued, her eyes steady. "They see you as a threat. You've been a judge for too long, made too many decisions that went against their interests. Now they're using their power to intimidate you. They think they can control you." Blake clenched his fists, his frustration spilling over. "I'm trapped, Sarah. The system's broken, and I can't even do anything about it." His shoulders slumped, a rare moment of vulnerability creeping through. He'd been the one to hold others accountable his entire life, but tonight, it felt as though no one was holding them accountable. He felt small in his own home. The weight of it all, the isolation, crushed him. The room at the HOA headquarters was packed, a mix of anxious residents, tight-lipped board members, and the ever-present hum of tension in the air. Judge Blake stood at the back, surveying the scene, his mind already racing through his plan. The atmosphere felt like a powder keg, nervous energy thick in the air, ready to ignite. It wasn't just his backyard anymore. He had come to realize that the HOA's overreach affected the entire neighborhood. Clara Westbrook, the HOA president, sat at the front, her posture rigid and authoritative. She called the meeting to order, her eyes scanning the room, perhaps with more disdain than she realized. Blake could feel the hostility rolling off her. She knew this meeting was going to be different. One by one, residents stood up to voice their frustrations. A middle-aged woman spoke about being fined for the wrong shade of blue paint on her fence, despite several houses on the block with the same color. A young family explained how their new playground equipment had been ordered removed even though it complied with all safety regulations. The complaints came pouring in: selective enforcement, arbitrary fines, and a total lack of transparency. Blake's heart quickened. This was the moment. As the room simmered with frustration, Blake stood and made his way to the front. "I think it's time we hold this board accountable," he said, his voice calm but powerful. "This isn't just about one man's garden. It's about protecting all of us from an HOA that oversteps its bounds." The room fell silent and Blake could feel the tide turning. He wasn't alone in this fight. As he spoke, he noticed several neighbors nodding in agreement, some even taking notes. Blake had started to rally support, building alliances one person at a time. The stakes had risen. This was no longer a personal battle. It was about the entire community, and Blake was ready to lead them in a fight for justice. The courtroom was packed. Local residents filled the seats, their eyes fixed on Judge Daniel Blake as he stood at the front, preparing to present his case. Media cameras clicked away, capturing every moment, eager for the story that had captivated the entire community. Blake had chosen to represent himself, no lawyer, just his legal knowledge and a deep sense of justice. Across from him sat Harold Woods, the smug HOA president, flanked by legal counsel. His stiff posture and cold expression betrayed no hint of nerves, but Blake could see the fear in his eyes, fear that this case could unravel everything he had worked for. Blake took a deep breath, looking over the courtroom before turning to face the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady. "This case is not just about a fine for a backyard garden. It's about the abuse of power and the erosion of basic rights. The HOA is supposed to be a force for community, not a tool for control." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. He then laid out his argument. The selective enforcement of the HOA's rules, the vague and inconsistent guidelines that left residents vulnerable to arbitrary fines, and the undeniable fact that he was being targeted because of his position. "The HOA has failed to apply its own rules fairly," Blake continued, his voice rising with passion. "It's not just about a garden. It's about the right of every homeowner to live without fear of retaliation, without fear of being bullied by those who hold power." The crowd shifted in their seats, murmurs of agreement spreading through the room. Blake could feel the tide turning. His words had struck a chord, and the energy in the room was palpable. As he finished his argument, he knew this was more than just a legal battle, it was a fight for the soul of the community. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Judge Daniel Blake stood, waiting for the final ruling. The air was thick with anticipation. The crowd, which had been packed with local residents and reporters just hours before, now hung on the edge of every word. Blake had done everything he could, exposed the HOA's inconsistencies, laid bare their selective enforcement, and argued fiercely for the rights of the community. But now it was in the hands of the presiding judge. Judge Martin, the same judge who had dismissed Blake's case earlier in the week, looked down at the papers before him, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. After careful consideration of the facts presented, Judge Martin began, his voice steady. "It is clear that the HOA, in its enforcement of its policies, has overstepped its bounds. The fine imposed upon Judge Blake is not only unjust, but it also represents a larger pattern of overreach that violates the rights of residents within this community." Blake felt a rush of relief flood his chest as the words sank in. "The HOA is hereby ordered to revise its enforcement policies. These revisions must ensure clear, consistent, and equitable application of all guidelines. Furthermore, any arbitrary fines previously levied against residents will be nullified." The room erupted in applause, the cheers echoing through the courtroom. Blake's shoulders, tense from months of fighting, finally relaxed. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a blow to the authoritarian grip the HOA had held over the neighborhood. Blake's heart swelled with pride as he left the courtroom, knowing he had stood up for what was right, both for himself and for his community. This victory wasn't just about one man's garden. It was about the power of standing up against injustice, and it would resonate long after the courtroom doors closed. The evening sun cast a warm glow over Judge Blake's backyard as friends and neighbors gathered, laughter filling the air. The once stifled community was now alive with energy and hope. The win over the HOA had done more than just lift a fine. It had sparked something deeper. The residents, once fearful of speaking out, now stood united, proud of the change they had helped bring about. Blake stood beside the grill, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he clinked glasses with his neighbors. Sarah, his wife, beamed at him from across the yard. She knew the toll the fight had taken on him, but tonight, they were celebrating more than a legal victory. They were celebrating the community they had helped restore. In the months that followed, the HOA was forced to undergo a complete overhaul. The new leadership, led by a board that was more transparent and fair, adopted new policies focused on fairness, communication, and community well-being. Blake's efforts had inspired change not only for him but for everyone around him. As the night wound down, Blake looked around at the smiling faces, reflecting on the journey. Even small battles, he realized, could have lasting impact if you were willing to fight for what was right. And in that moment, his legacy as a protector of personal rights was solidified, far beyond the courtroom.